Hello, everyone. This is Professor Joe, and we are in a course on religion in Latin America in the fall, the amazing fall of 2020. And this week is week 8, halfway through the semester. And today we're going to talk about Jews in Latin America. In this course, we primarily deal with Catholicism as the dominant religious influence through nearly 500 years of Latin American history. But we started out the course taking a look at Mayan religious worldview in the Popol Vuh. And we also have a couple weeks devoted to Afro-diasporan, Afro-spiritist religions in Cuba and Brazil. Today we're talking about Judaism in Latin America, and before the semester's over, we'll talk about Islam in Latin America. So today, let's take a deep dive into Judaism in Latin America. Did it exist? How strong was it? Where did it come from? What were the factors involved in the spread of Judaism from Europe to the Americas? So let me go to my Prezi, and the first point we have here is the historical context. In 1391, which is immediately after the Black Plague, people became very suspicious and fearful, and as they're often inclined to do in times of pandemics and crises, they look for someone to blame. We see that today in 2020. A lot of people are wanting to blame someone for economic problems and the pandemic problems. In this case, a lot of Europeans and most of the European countries began to blame Jews because they stood apart. They might be considered a pariah group, and they resisted assimilation into dominant European Christianity. And so in 1391, there was an dramatic increase in anti-Semitism resulting from the Black Plague, and you begin to have pogroms and persecution of many Jewish people and all throughout Europe. Spain was no stranger to this. Spain had, in southern Spain, in the Islamic area of Granada, had been famous for la convivencia, which means the mutual understanding, or the living together, the shared culture between Jews, Muslims, and Christians in the golden age of this period up and before 1400. But after 1391, and of course also after the 800 years of the Reconquest, Spanish Catholicism had become merged with the Spanish state and nationality, and also had become quite weaponized militantly as a militant arm of the Spanish monarchy. And so the king and queen of Spain began a drive towards not only unification of the various regions of Spain under one throne, but they also began a drive for religious homogeneity, which is going to have a tremendous impact on Jews and Muslims alike. And very soon, around the same year that Columbus sailed to the Western Hemisphere, the Jews and Muslims were given an ultimatum to convert to Christianity or to flee the country. And so that was in 1480. The Spanish Catholic Church invented the Inquisition, specifically aimed at conversos. Conversos were Jews that converted to Catholicism ostensibly in order to avoid persecution and exile. They were also called New Christians. They were called Marranos, which is a derogatory term referring to swine or pigs. So the people who did convert to Catholicism, who had formerly been Jews as well as Muslims, were continually under great suspicion. Their sincerity was doubted and their motives were doubted. And so the Inquisition was invented in order to provide social control and to intimidate and pressure them to be good Catholics. In the Inquisition, you were guilty until proven innocent. And of course, by the time you're proven innocent, your health might have been entirely broken in, and also your wealth. So that became an instrument of control, religious and political control of the crown. I've already mentioned the Reconquista, which lasted 800 years and created the founding myth of the Spanish nation. In 1492, about 6 months before Christopher Columbus sailed to the Bahamas, the Spanish troops finally conquered Grenada and took control of the entire peninsula of Iberia, with the exception of Portugal, which managed to resist absorption into the Spanish monarchy. And the Queen Isabella issued an edict of expulsion. Conversos, or the new Christians, or the Marranos, were those who stayed in order to avoid expulsion and converted to Catholicism. Some of them were perhaps sincere Christians. It's hard to know how many or which sincere converts. Others were crypto Jews, or hidden Jews, which means they didn't give up their Jewish faith, but they pretended outwardly, and they went to Mass and they pretended outwardly to give all the signals of Catholicism in order to avoid persecution. They were guilty until proven innocent under the Inquisition. They were subject to arrest without habeas corpus, and also with judicial torture. This can make us appreciate some of our judicial rights as American citizens when we realize how rare it is for people to have habeas corpus and presumption of innocence until proven guilty, and to be immune from torture. Here's a map of Spain. As you see, Spain was divided up actually into a number of smaller kingdoms. The kingdom of Castile and Leon were united by a marriage between Isabella and Ferdinand. The kingdom of Aragon had its dependencies. The kingdom of Navarre, the kingdom of Portugal, which maintained its independence right up until today, and the Moorish kingdom of Granada until 1492. And it was in Granada under Muslim rule, ironically enough, despite the popular preconceptions of modern Islamism, it was under Muslim rule that the greatest period of flourishing and peaceful co-working and coexistence happened among Jews, Muslims, and Christians. And that's a part of history worth studying. The kingdom of Portugal was pressured by the Spanish monarchs to get rid of their Jews as well, but the King Emmanuel was reluctant to do that because he viewed his Jews as an economic asset. Oftentimes Jews, especially after this period, Jewish families were scattered between Spain, Portugal, Holland, Brazil, Mexico, and so they were able to set up international or global networks of finance, and this made it a natural opportunity for them to become lenders, of bankers in this period of time. And Emmanuel did not want to lose his bankers, basically. But nevertheless, on one night, 1497, approximately 5 years after Spain did the same thing, Portugal gave a ultimatum to the Jews in the Portuguese territories, and 1/5 of the population converted and became new Christians. Philip II, from 1556 to 1598, Philip II was the king of Spain, who sent the Spanish Armada against Elizabeth I in England. He began to elaborate this concept of limpieza de sangre, or a standard of clean blood. In other words, if you were a converso from Judaism or Islam and became a Spanish Catholic, even if your family went back 3, 4, 5 generations, if you had a drop of Moorish blood or Jewish blood, you were not clean. You did not have clean blood, limpieza de sangre. And so you were suspect, and you were also passed over for the most preeminent economic or political opportunities. This will carry over into the New World, into the Americas, where limpieza de sangre becomes a huge issue for people's opportunities. Jewish ancestry brought an ineradicable stain in the blood. Despite the fact that many famous Latin Americans that we'll see later were descended from conversos. Sor Juana de la Cruz, the famous Mexican nun, is just one example among many. So Columbus' first voyage was financed by the conversos. And so the conversos, the former Jewish Spanish people, were ineradicably involved in the arrival in the New World and in the development of the Spanish Empire, despite the persecution against them. That's the Jewish candelabra. So the Spanish Indies. Judaism arrives in Spanish Indies even with Christopher Columbus. There was rumors that one of his navigators was a converso. Queen Isabella barred Jews, Moors, and heretics and new Christians from immigrating to the Americas. And her son, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, repeated the orders and reissued them in 1520. Nevertheless, there were many conversos involved in the conquest of the New World. Hernando Alonso is just one example. He was a blacksmith and a ship's carpenter with Hernan Cortez's army that invaded the Anahuac, the Aztec Empire, and conquered Tenochtitlan. The judgment of historians is that the Inquisition was an instrument of social control, and so as the Spanish arrived in the New World, they brought with them the Inquisition, particularly for Jews and Jewish conversos, also suspected Muslim conversos, but also, and before long, within a few years, also Luteranos, or that was a generic term meaning Lutherans, but it was applied to all Protestant heretics. The famous Mexican Catholics who may have descended from Jews includes Luis de Carvajal de la Cueva, governor of the province of Nuevo León and a faithful Catholic, and also Sor Juana de la Cruz, who was the famous nun who was a genius that you have seen already in the film Yo, la peor de todos, or I, the most sinful one. Also Franciscan Friar Bernardino de Sahagún. He was considered to be a proto-anthropologist. He was a Franciscan. He studied the Aztec language, Nahuatl. He translated a good bit of it into Spanish, Castilian, and he studied Aztec beliefs and customs and culture, and wrote an Historia General de, I can't remember the rest of it, Historia General of the Aztec culture, and was considered to be one of the most impressive intellects among the Franciscans. And there's a couple of pictures. At the bottom there's Bernardino de Sahagún, and at the top is Queen Isabella. The Portuguese in Brazil. This process was not only going on with the Spanish, but also the Portuguese. In fact, in 1492, when the Spanish Jews were compelled to convert to Catholicism, some number of them fled to Portugal, where there was still a degree of tolerance. And when Portugal 5 years later began to pressure them to convert, then many of them went to Brazil. And actually, the most populous group of Jewish immigrants in Latin America in the early years were in Brazil, among the Portuguese. Most new Christians who came to the New World were Portuguese rather than Spanish. They were unwelcome commercial competition of the Portuguese, won for the name of Judeo. So amongst the Spanish colonies, they referred to any Portuguese commercial trader as a Judeo. And even though they weren't all, obviously only a small number of them were Jews, but the Portuguese took on this image of Judeos in their commercial relations with the Spanish. There was one synagogue in Pernambuco that operated openly and legally. Even some officials of the Catholic Church were conversos. Also, there's a period of time from about 1580 through 1640 that's called the Babylonian captivity of Portugal. That's wrong. That's the captivity of the Portuguese court by Spain. But there's also a period of time that the Dutch took possession of the northeast, the sugar-producing area of the northeast of Brazil, and maintained about a 60 or 80-year period where the Dutch were in control instead of the Portuguese. And the Dutch reformed, and the Dutch trading company, it was called the Dutch West India Company in Brazil, was much more tolerant of religious freedom than was even the Portuguese Catholics were more tolerant than the Spanish. And so you could be a Jew openly in the Dutch territories in Brazil, and they had a number of synagogues there. Some families had members living in both Holland and Brazil. In Bahia, 20% of the white population of 8 to 10,000 were Cristãos Novos, which is Cristianos Nuevos in Portuguese. The Dutch West India Company in Brazil was very open and very tolerant of Jews. When finally the Dutch were defeated by a combination of Portuguese soldiers and Brazilians and Brazilian Indians, a lot of the Jews left. About 150 families left with the Dutch to go back to Amsterdam. Another 50 or so families stayed and tried to make life livable under the Portuguese. Then comes the period of Latin American independence, the Napoleonic Wars. This came shortly after the War of Independence for the United States by the British colonists against the mother country. And then you had the French Revolution, and you had the Haitian Revolution, and then in 1808, the invasion of Napoleon into Spain on his way to arrive in Portugal was the spark that launched that lit the bonfire of independence in Latin America. And you had over the next 20 or 25 years, you had fierce, brutal wars of independence raging from Argentina to Colombia and Venezuela and into Mexico. And this, of course, is going to bring upheaval to the Catholic Church. And it's also going to mark the rise of political and philosophical liberalism in Latin America, which tended to be anti-clerical and in favor of separation of church and state and guarantees of religious freedom, which of course was good for Jews as well as later the Protestants. So Jews were nervous about returning to Spanish republics out of a fear of a Spanish resurgence, with good reason, because there was a Spanish resurgence partway through the wars of independence, especially in Colombia. Some Curaçaoan Jews took up residence in Venezuela. Jews always attracted the sympathy of the anti-Spanish and anti-clerical factions among the Creoles in the Spanish republics. Contemporary Latin American Jews were not descendants. That is to say, contemporary Latin American Jews are not descendants of conversos. The conversos were either persecuted or died out or blended in with the dominant Creole and mestizo cultures in Latin America. Despite a great deal of immigration of conversos from Portugal and Spain into the New World, they were not the antecedents of modern Judaism in Latin America. That came more from immigration at the end of the 19th century. So once these countries became independent, the big debate among conservatives who tended to be Catholic or fiercely Catholic and liberals who tended to be marginally Catholic but anti-clerical was whether their Latin American respective countries would advance more by maintaining their Hispanic and Catholic and monarchical traditions, or whether modernization would come through modern Enlightenment philosophies and education systems led by Protestants, and of course this had a great effect on the Jewish populations living in Mexico City and Buenos Aires. So what the question was, should they attempt to break up the Catholic religious monopoly, which was a monolithic monopoly through most of Latin America, or should they sustain the Catholic Hispanic tradition, or should they encourage the immigration of Protestants, guarantee religious freedom, and try to break up the monopoly of Catholicism, medieval Spanish Catholicism in Latin America? So this brings us up to immigration in a number of countries, particularly Argentina, to some degree also Chile, even Brazil, Uruguay, began to attempt to attract immigrants from Northern Europe, Anglo-Saxon immigrants or German immigrants, thinking that they would bring their work habits, their work ethic, their technology, their knowledge of industrialization with them to Latin America, and that it would whiten these Latin American republics, and also at the same time provide a greater advance of economics and industrialization. A good friend of mine, Erica Edwards, did her research in Argentina and wrote a book about what happened to Afro-Argentines in Argentina who seemed to disappear. And she shows that they didn't really disappear, but there was a process of whitening, and to some degree, many of them were assimilated into the dominant Argentine culture. Sources of Jewish immigration. Jews were part of this wave of immigration that started coming to Argentina in the 1860s. On a much smaller level in Mexico. At least 2% of the European population were Jewish immigrants to Latin America, but at least 6% of the wave of European immigration to Latin America were Jews. Let me say that again more clearly. So Jews represented 2% of the European population, but of the wave of immigration, they were at least 6%, which shows that they immigrated in much higher numbers from Europe. There were two kinds of immigrations from Europe and the Middle East. One was Ashkenazi Jews, which were usually European, often Northern European. That could be German or Polish or Russian. And then the Sephardic Jews were Sephardic, coming from Sephardi, which was the name of the Spanish Jews that were forced to immigrate. Many Spanish Jews, when they were forced to convert and assimilate or immigrate, moved to Morocco, Northern Africa, Syria, the Ottoman Empire, and they learned to speak Arabic, but they were still Jewish in many of those countries, Egypt. And so there were two fountains of immigration to Latin America, one being the Sephardic Jews, which often were Spanish-speaking, Portuguese-speaking, or even more often Arabic-speaking. And of course, they had very different subcultures than the Ashkenazi European Jews that spoke German or French or Polish. The Moroccan Jews, the early period of Jewish migration can be divided into periods. The Moroccan Jews were among the first to immigrate, Sephardic Jews, from about 1859 to 1860. They immigrated. The majority of them immigrated to Brazil and Argentina. Also, as early as the 1830s, you had German and French Jews who were immigrating to Mexico and Argentina. Again, in the 1880s up to the 1939, the later period of immigration, you had 5 million Jews taking part of a wave of international immigration to the New World. There was a huge labor shortage in the New World. And of course, African slavery was used to partly fill that need of cheap labor. But then when most countries abolished slavery after about 1880, that would be Brazil and Cuba in particular, and of course the United States with the Civil War, then the labor shortage had to be made up by immigration from Europe. So, do I have more? I do have more. So where did they go as they immigrated to Latin America? A large number went to Argentina, which yielded a large Argentine Jewish population that's there today with a number of synagogues. Some went to Chile. A much smaller number went to Mexico. However, there was 100 Jewish men in Mexico in 1861 who organized and held meetings. Also, a large number went to Brazil and Guatemala. In 1833, there was a proclamation of religious toleration in Guatemala under a liberal caudillo. And in 1870, the first congregation of German Jews and Sephardim and European Jews may not have even been able to recognize one another as Jewish because they came from such vastly different subcultures in the Arab world and in the German or European world. Over on the right there, you see some Jews from the Ottoman Empire arriving in Mexico at Veracruz in the 19th century. Mexican positivism. Actually, I shouldn't say Mexican. Positivism was a pseudo-scientific and materialist philosophy that arose with a philosopher named Auguste Comte, a Frenchman, who developed this philosophy of positivism that was in favor of modernization and science, and it also tended to go along with philosophical liberalism in Latin America. The liberalism of the Mexican Reforma in the 1850s had been relatively tolerant of religious differences, but the liberalism of the restored Mexican Republic was much less tolerant. That is, after the invasion of the French and the war with the French, Benito Juarez became wary of excessive liberalism and excessive religious diversity. And so they moved over to this philosophical positivism with its emphasis on material progress and its negativity towards spiritual values. Positivism also had some racialist overtones and tendencies. Empiricism replaced mysticism. There was no room left in the official ideology for individual religious belief. And so the Jews that were living in Mexico were caught in a crunch between the fervent religious devotion of the rank and file Mexican people, Mexican peasants, who were very Catholic and very religious, and the government, which was very materialist, very anti-religious, not only anti-clerical, which a good Catholic could be anti-clerical if they held a liberal philosophy. Anti-clerical simply means that the church and church officers should stay out of politics. But anti-religion is a much stronger step further towards opposing religion. And that created a real problem for Jews living in Mexico. They were caught between the hammer and the anvil, as the author of the book says. The Jews who were immigrating to Mexico were mostly Syrian Arabic Jews arriving in Mexico from the Ottoman Empire. In Brazil, you had an imperial constitution in 1824 that recognized Catholicism as the official religion but guaranteed the right to exercise other religions in private. Sephardim Jews began to immigrate from Morocco to Amazonia shortly after independence. Dom Pedro II, who spent 60 years as the emperor, the second emperor of the Empire of Brazil, was a lifelong scholar of the Bible, and he studied the Old Testament in the original Hebrew. Western European Jews began entering Brazil during Dom Pedro's reign. He was somewhat enlightened. He was favorable to liberal philosophy. Many of these West European Jews became owners of coffee plantations. By the 1870s, German Jews were also engaged in manufacture and construction in Brazil. And there you see some Jews, modern Jews in the contemporary period with the Brazilian flag, which I will point out has no color red in it because the Brazilian Revolution or War of Independence was bloodless. and also the Jewish flag. Argentina, another interesting case of Judaism in Latin America. The first organized synagogue in Argentina, as we said before, was in about 1860. Most of the founding members were Ashkenazi, in other words, European Jews, Northern European. Eventually, some Moroccan Jews also joined, but by 1891, the Sephardim created their own synagogue called the Congregación Israelita Latina. They used Spanish and Portuguese rite. European Jews went to the cities and focused on retail merchandising, while the Sephardim, those Jews from Northern Africa, the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire, as well as Spain and Portugal, were slightly more likely to go to the interior and to smaller towns and to work in farming and agriculture. On a more contemporary note, in 1994, let me back up. In the 1940s, post-World War II, a number of Nazi officials escaped to Argentina and lived in hiding, because Juan Perón was somewhat sympathetic during World War II with the Nazis in Germany. The most famous case was Eichmann. I'm drawing a blank on his first name, Adolf Eichmann, I think it was, who was the architect of the Shoah, or the Holocaust, the logistical side of the Holocaust, and he escaped to Argentina, was living in Buenos Aires, and was kidnapped by Israeli operatives and brought back to Israel for trial and execution. A little bit later, in 1994, there was a terror attack against a synagogue in Buenos Aires that cost 84 lives. There's a couple pictures of the destroyed building and pictures of the people who died. I don't know if it's been proven, but the suspicion fell heavily on the Revolutionary Republic of Iran as the sponsor of this terror attack in Argentina. And so Judaism has had a strong history in Argentina, and an important one. There's a book also about a Jewish journalist who was taken captive or disappeared, Jacob Timmerman, in the Argentine Dirty War, and was persecuted because of anti-Semitic reasons, as well as suspicion of left-leaning sympathies. Jewish immigration to Latin America. To sum it up, Portuguese Sephardi of Curaçao dispersed in neighboring Spanish lands along the Caribbean coast. Of course, Curaçao had been was a Dutch territory, and that's why Portuguese Jews were in Curaçao. West European Askenazim from France, Germany, Alsace, France, Lorraine, Switzerland, and England scattered through the cities of Argentina, Chile, Guatemala, Mexico, Brazil, and Peru. Spanish-speaking Sephardim from North Africa ventured into the Amazon region of Brazil or Peru, and Arabic-speaking Sephardim in provincial towns of Argentina, Mexico, and the Amazon engaged in farming. The formation of a contemporary Jewish communities was a function of religious toleration and economic incentive on the one hand, and the massive immigration of heterogeneous peoples on the other. And that finishes our overview of Jews in Latin America today. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget the midterm this week, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care.